Hello and welcome. So this is sort of breakdown, um, analysis, reading of Nietzsche's essay, "The Use and Abuse of History for Life." And yeah, this is personally one of my favorite Nietzsche essays. It's a bit less Nietzschean, I suppose, kind of polemic than some of his other stuff, like the genealogy of morals, for example. Um, it's a bit more structural. He gives us some kind of more structural categories of history and how to use history, which we're going to get into, which is interesting. It's kind of not a very Nietzschean thing to do, um, but it's quite good. It actually gives the essay more structure, which I think is good. Um, and yeah, it's a kind of lesser known Nietzsche essay, which is, I don't know why it's lesser known. I suppose people are sort of more interested in the Ubermensch or in slave morality than they are in Nietzsche's idea of history. But Nietzsche's idea of history is actually really interesting and really important if you actually want to understand things like the Ubermensch or the Last Man or slave morality. These are kind of things which I think you can't really get a good grasp on without going into Nietzsche's view of history. Because the last man is a historical claim. It's about the last man. It's a temporal claim. He's the last. He's not the first. He's the last. Um, is a kind of is a kind of claim on a genesis, a generational character to that claim. And the Ubermensch, of course, is a response to that, and so on and so forth. You know. Okay. So the more popular notions in Nietzsche are as I'm not saying they're not important; they're essential, but they're not as easily understood as well understood, unless you have a broader understanding of Nietzsche. So this is actually quite useful for that. I actually think that it was Mark Fisher who made this essay a little bit more famous because he discusses this essay in one of his books. I can't remember which one, or maybe it was just a lecture he was talking about it. But I remember originally hearing about this essay years ago, either from reading or listening to a Mark Fisher essay, because it deals with the end of history. It deals with ideas about history which are very, very relevant to thinking through the end of history. So, this essay has some interesting. It's been used in some interesting ways over time by some different kinds of people you wouldn't expect. I mean, today's Nietzscheanism is more right winged. Nietzsche kind of went through more of a left wing interpretive phase. At least I'm talking about people who read him, not Nietzsche himself, but people who read him. Um, and yeah, this essay seemed to be a bit more popular among some of the left wing Nietzsche readers than it is today. But anyway, I thought I would do a little breakdown of it and yeah, just have a little analysis of this essay. So Nietzsche, he begins with a quote by Goethe. So he says, "Incidentally, I despise everything which merely instructs me without increasing or immediately enlivening my activity." Um, and then he says, "For this work, this essay is to set down why, in the spirit of Goethe's saying, we must seriously despise instruction without vitality, knowledge which enervates activity, and history as an expense surplus of knowledge and a luxury, because we lack what is still most essential to us, and because what is superfluous is hostile to what is essential." Okay, so I suppose immediately you see that Nietzsche's task here is obviously he's trying to conduct a correct way to study history and relate to history, which is conducive to life. And in obviously that's the title, right? So in doing so, there's a kind of attempt to strip away the fat of history. So we learn all this historical, in very simple terms. This theme will be repeated throughout throughout this essay. But we learn all this historical knowledge, and like, what is it that we should be learning, focusing on, and what should we be ignoring? In simple terms, it's a sort of trimming the fat epistemically, we could say, and was trimming the fat. Um, as you'll see in this essay, Nietzsche feels, in his time at least, that people are sort of bombarded with a historical education which doesn't really give them anything. It sort of even deprives them of something. It sort of inhibits them in some sense, right? And the task here is not to deny history, but it's to sort of trim the fat and um, remove the superfluous and sort of get to the essential. Um, so to continue on this introductory paragraph, he says, "To be sure, we need history, but we need it in a manner different from the way in which the spoilt idler in the garden of knowledge uses it. No matter how elegantly he may look down on our coarse and graceless needs and distresses, that is, we need it for life and for action, not for a comfortable turning away from life and action, or merely for glossing over the egotistical life and the cowardly bad act." So again, there's this theme of something being superfluous. This thinker, someone thinking, and he's spoiled. He's in a garden of knowledge, and he's idle. He's spoiled. Yeah. So there's a sort of criticism, I suppose, of education, I think, which goes out through this essay as well. Because Nietzsche's a 19th century person. He was living in the late 19th century. This is a time where, if you were in any way sort of educated person, you had access to a lot of books, a lot of knowledge. I mean, history, knowledge both in the scientific sense and in the sort of sociological sense, and everything is built up and built up over time, right? So there's times in history, I suppose we could say, where you get to a build up of lots of knowledge, all sorts of knowledge, and then one sort of, almost like they're getting richer and richer and richer, and they've got all they got all this money, and they don't know what to do with the money, and suddenly the money becomes like a kind of burden to them. They have to think the whole time what to do with it, invest it, save it, spend it. It sort of changes your relationships to people, I think, too. I've heard this from people that like win the lottery or something, that they're not actually happier often, because it burdens them in so many ways. Excess burdens people, really, and it changes the way they think. It changes their relationships to other people, to the world. Everything changes with excess. And here we're talking about the excess of the building up of knowledge. Now, of course, this is a problem of the Enlightenment as much as anything else. It's a problem of modern, rational, enlightened nations who've built up a lot of knowledge, mass education, and so forth. So we're sitting in this garden, and we've got all this knowledge, and we're sort of spoiled, and we don't know what to do with it all. It should also be noted that there is sort of a sort of connotation here of also the Garden of Eden, So the Garden of Eden, abundance, and then the apple is eaten. In this paradigm, it's not really an apple, which I suppose stands for what, like, I don't know, some sort of sensuousness or something, but or appetite maybe. It's not really that is the sin here. The sin, if we can put it that way, is knowledge itself. The thing we've been tempted by here is actually knowledge itself. So within this task of stripping down the superfluous, we're also talking about the task of, I suppose you could say, immersing ourselves within the present. One of the symptoms, we could say, of this excessive build-up of knowledge is that we are not as easily able to be immersed in a present. We can't be we can't sort of forget things which don't give us anything. Like, there's no point to know this kind of things, which, I mean, it's very relevant to our time as well, because we're so bombarded with knowledge because of the internet, and because of also we've been through an era of mass education. Late 20th century was very similar to the late 19th century in many ways. I think it's a very wealthy time, peaceful time, relatively speaking. Um, and both in the 19th century and actually in the late 20th century, we've had a build-up of knowledge in different ways. Science advances in science and technology, and mass education. And so these moments in history where we build up knowledge, and there's something about this knowledge which is like making it more difficult for us to sort of be immersed in our own existences in life. So to continue reading, Nietzsche says, "The person who cannot set himself down on the crest of the moment, forgetting everything from the past, who is not capable of standing on a single point like a goddess of victory without dizziness or fear, will never know what happiness is. Even worse, he will never do anything to make other people happy. Imagine the most extreme example: a person who did not possess the power of forgetting at all, who would be condemned to see everywhere a coming into being. Such a person no longer believes in his own being, no longer believes in himself, sees everything in moving points, flowing out of each other, and loses himself in this stream of becoming." So there's also, quite typically a kind of psychological issue at the center of this broader problem, which is typical for Nietzsche, in which forgetting is a kind of a task which takes a lot of forgetting isn't something that people do accidentally necessarily. Like, you don't necessarily just forget because you've forgotten to remember. This is the sort of Enlightenment dogma, you see. It's that we think that remembering, and I mean, this is also maybe a kind of critique of Plato as well, although I mean, maybe not a very good critique of Plato, because recollection in Platonic terms is very complicated. But nonetheless, if you focus on remembering, and I mean, focus more here on education in general. Like, think of something like route learning. You have to remember everything. You have to know facts about history. You have to remember things. Your kind of cognitive focus is on remembering. And then we see forgetting as like a failure. If you forget things, you're a failure. Oh, you've forgotten to pay your bills. Oh, you've forgotten to memorize the historical facts that happened in the, whatever, 15th century, 16th century. Oh, you failed your exam. Oh, you forgot what time you had to go to work. You're late for work. Okay? So we kind of live in this world which is like, everything is like remembering is good, and forgetting is always an accident, it's always a failure, it's always bad. But Nietzsche's flipping it around, and he's saying, no, like, forgetting is really good. And forgetting is actually a task which doesn't come about merely out of accident or merely out of failure. It's something we actually have to strive towards. We have to kind of relearn the capacity to forget. Because if we can't forget, then we're not able to sort of exist in the full sense that Nietzsche is describing here. And this is also important for genealogy of morals and slave morality and all that, because resentment is a memory. It's because your memory remembers an injury, a harm, and it kind of gets kind of consumed by that. And then there's a need for revenge, and then the point of the acting out of the vengeance, of the revenge of the harm, is so they can forget. If they don't have revenge, they'll never forget. If they have revenge, then they can forget. So forgetting, the kind of virtue of forgetting, is, of course, very much being promoted here by Nietzsche. So our focus on memory and on learning about the past, in simple terms, is being kind of challenged here by Nietzsche, and supplemented with another sort of pole, we could say, another pole to this emphasis of modern education, of historical learning, of scientific build-up and scientific knowledge. There's a opposition, which is forgetfulness. The historical has an opposition, it's the unhistorical. And This is basically kind of the sort of groundwork of the rivalry dynamic, or the sort of polemic, which is at the basis of this essay, which is to challenge a over focus on remembering, and the buildup of knowledge with forgetting, and the unhistorical, and the trimming of that knowledge, the cutting off the fat, we could say, which is a very philosophical thing to do anyway, because the thing that philosophers like to do is try to get to the essential, whereas what scientists like to do is to build up loads of facts, and often not have a coherent structure for those facts, or a way in which those facts relate to each other. This is build up, especially today, because of all the, I mean, think of all the data that's collected through the internet, or just through communication, or bureaucracy, all this stuff. Like, like, what's the point in all this? Where is this going? Like, what's this big build up of people are storing this knowledge, this data everywhere, and what's it for? You know, like, is it going to help us in any way? Yeah. So there's a trimming, and Nietzsche will say here in the first in the first kind of section. This is the specific principle which the reader is invited to consider, for that for the health of a single individual, a people, and a culture, the unhistorical and the historical are equally essential. So the unhistorical is as essential as the historical. Later on, in this next paragraph, he says, thus we have to assess the capacity of being able to feel to a certain degree unhistorically as more important and more basic, to the extent that in it lies the foundation above which something right healthy and great, something truly human, can generally first grow. The unhistorical is like an enveloping atmosphere in which life generates itself alone, only to disappear again with the destruction of this atmosphere. Another few sentences, a few paragraphs later, which I quite liked as a summary, was: no artist would achieve his picture, no field marshal his victory, and no people its freedom without previously having desired and striven for them in that sort of unhistorical condition. So, even though we like to study history and like to study these, these special moments in history and these achievements by people in history, there's something at the basis of that actual activity which is unhistorical. And again, this is a kind of end of history problem, post-historical subjectivity problem, which is that we over rely on historical reference points for everything. Like, we sort of we're almost like children who kind of look to their parents to tell them what to do, something like that. Like, we're unable to just kind of take the initiative ourselves and just sort of act out of instinct or impulse, figure it out on our own, take the risk, go off track. I think there's a kind of going off track, to use a kind of more spatial analogy than a temporal analogy, to go off track and to just get lost in the woods and see what happens. And we're always looking for the trail that's been already built by people in the past that have, but that trail was not built with a map. That trail was built by people just going out there. So again, post-historical problems is that, like, it's difficult to find those moments of being the first in something or at something or somewhere. The activity loses its it loses its primacy, its immediacy. It's always caught up too much in a reference point to someone else who's already been there and built the track and written the map and so on. So there's, before we go any further, could be some thoughts on this over historicization or excessive buildup of knowledge in history. These moments, I think, again, I think this is very relevant to the late 20th century. The late 19th century and late 20th century, I've always argued, were much more similar than we recognize. Partly because the whole counterculture revolution, the sexual revolution of the 60s, is quite unique in history, certainly in modern history. So it sort of gives us the false impression that that entire late 20th century was very, 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 very unique. But it was very similar to the 19th century in many ways, especially in terms of a build up in knowledge and a strong emphasis on progress, um, um, and wealth, affluence, build up wealth, and also a big expansion of the middle class, which also happened in the late 20th and the late 20th century. Loads of working class people kind of got subsumed into this bigger middle class. There was an expansion in the middle class of the 19th century because of the Industrial Revolution and all that stuff, right? So you get very similar actual patterns between the two, and one of the things that both of these times has in common, and I think this is why someone like Mark Fisher picked up on this essay kind of early 21st century, late 20th century, dealing with these issues at the end of history, basically, was because there's something about moments of kind of historical malaise, um, which you see big build ups in scientific knowledge, technological maybe progress, um, periods of mass education, more people being educated, for example. I mean, even if being from Ireland, for example, the older generation, the oldest generation of people, especially from the countryside, like so many of them just quit school when they were like 15 or something, and they went into working for their dad or for their uncle or, I don't know, or they moved to a different country and just worked in construction or something. Like, it's kind of rare today. Like everyone finishes school at like 18, and everyone has to go to university and get a degree. There's like we are overeducated, and we're not well educated, but we're overeducated. And I would say compared to Nietzsche's time, we're badly educated. Like it's funny because Nietzsche's kind of complaining about the bad, as we'll see in this essay. He starts complaining about the bad education of the Germans of his time. But I could only imagine how much better that education was of the Germans of the late 19th century that he's talking about than today. Like, probably uncomparable. I think he'd be shocked to see how bad education is today. But nonetheless, there is a similar pattern insofar that you've got mass education, build up of affluence, technological progress, um, and this all feeds into each other. You don't really have economic growth without the mass education. You need the mass education to perpetuate the economic growth. The industries want people to be educated in a certain way, and so on and so forth. So it's like, these moments in history are build-ups of knowledge, and they have their benefits. Builds up of wealth. People are mass educated. It seems nice. It seems good, but it's not always good. It has these downsides to it, and this kind of philosophical crisis of history itself seems to be one of those symptoms. The super How do we put it? When you have this build up, you need to go through a kind of purge, maybe a kind of metaphysical purge, an educational purge. Um, a trimming of the fat, a kind of even a kind of purification, maybe. There's patterns here, the cyclical patterns here, um, of particularly modern society when you have these build-ups of kind of almost like inflations of knowledge inflations, as opposed to just simply financial inflations. We have a kind of knowledge inflation, and then there's a task of trimming that back down, cutting off the fat. Um, I just an anecdotal example of this, because I actually do think, coming from Ireland, we are a little bit better when it comes to this, because our country is so, like, at least our republic is so, it's only 100 years old, basically, right? So we basically in history, in school, learn that moment in history, and that's basically it. Right? Like, we do a little bit of world history. We do, at least when I was in school, we did a little bit of world history, which is much more interesting to me, actually. We do a little bit of, like, the Stone Age, like what were people in Ireland doing in the Stone Age or something, or when did we first become farmers from hunter gatherers? But we basically ignore like almost everything from like the Stone Age until the War of Independence, right? And then you learn everything about the War of Independence basically in this really boring detail. Um, and that's it basically. That's how I remember learning history in school. Um, yeah, so it, we I did we were a particular example that we're so sort of self-obsessed with our own identity in terms of getting independence that it sort of trims the fat itself. um, so I feel like we're not too over historicized in Ireland. In fact, I mean, we are maybe a little bit obsessed with a particular time in history, and we forget about the what was happening in Ireland in the 19th and 18th, and well, the famine, of course. You see, this is the problem with, if we just talk from this particular perspective for a moment, this is the problem with the 19th century of Ireland was so crap, right? The 20th century was a kind of redemption, so we just ignore everything before the 20th century and we just focus on the early 20th century. Um, which was terrible for the rest of the world, rest of Europe, but was actually quite good for Ireland. Like, at least because we got a republic and that. So anyway, we have a very different historical perspective to pretty much most other Western countries, if not all other Western countries. Um, we're actually one of the advantages that we have, I think, in our education system. Maybe it's different nowadays, but when I grew up, is that we're actually really not over historicized too much. Uh, we probably have a little bit of a sort of monopolized historical period to focus on, and that's the only thing that's important. But we don't have this. We don't actually have a build up. Um, but I think the Germans and the English and the Americans and the French, you know, probably at this time did have a build up because they, were more advanced countries in the 19th century. The 19th century. Okay, so I guess the thing I'm trying to say is, see, the 19th century was crap for Ireland, but it was good for England. It was good for Germany. It was good for France. It was good for America. It was good for all these other places. Um, and it's particularly a symptom of this time because you have such an emphasis on progress, and the accumulation of knowledge is so important for industries and for mass education and for competing with these other countries economically. Another symptom of this problem is overemphasis on economy. Once you have an overemphasis on economy, mass education becomes more important, and you get kind of these sorts of build-ups. But anyway, those differences aside, if you flip to the 20th century, I think the late 20th century, we're all in a similar position because we're really over historicized, particularly focusing on like the mid 20th century and the early 20th century, and focusing on the wars in Europe and the Holocaust and all this. In America, you've got going back to slavery. In England and France, you've got colonization. So there's a kind of hyper moralization of our historical knowledge, um, which affects how people think and how people behave, and I think it conditions their temperament in many ways, um, which you see that like learning about facts and just learning sort of for exams, learning dates and times and so on. It's never that innocent or neutral. There's always a kind of moral injunction and moral reasoning for why you should learn these things. Um, I think every major country, major Western country at this point has this problem. The English have colonialism, the Germans have the Holocaust, the Americans have slavery, and all the other countries sort of share in this. Like I would imagine today, if you went back to school, if I had like a kid or something, and he was going through history class in school, I would imagine that the curriculum had sort of become intertwined. In fact, I've seen evidence of this online, just with people in school in Ireland whose parents have posted up their grievances with the curriculums recently, but I'm sure that there would be an involvement of this sort of burdening kind of moral, historical guilt of things which Ireland actually weren't involved with because we were the victims of colonialization. But we would sort of share in it, as if to say colonialization, for example, was somehow our historical burden as well, even though it's objectively not. But why would that be included? It's because historical education contains in it character molding, I would say, character molding inclinations, which are kind of come with the bare minimal rational learning of facts and dates. And I think this is very prescient even in that sort of annoying trope that you will hear from all people left, right, and center, which is if we don't learn about the past, we're going to repeat it in the future. If we don't learn about the past, we're going to repeat it in the future. It's almost a bit like saying, I rode my bike one day and it was wet and I slipped and I fell and I hurt my knee. So every time I ride my bike, I have to sort of like wear bubble wrap. I have to sort of avoid every puddle. I have to sort of I have to be really neurotically aware of danger because one time something bad happened. And I think this is basically, I think, what historical education does to an immense degree today, very damaging, is that it sort of eats away at the capacity for risk and initiative, because it over reminds ourselves of like failures and accidents and bad behaviors and crimes of the past. And I'm not saying we shouldn't learn about these things. I'm just saying that like you do have to weigh up how much learning and what's the tone of that learning, what's the context of that learning, what's the reasoning of that learning. How do you balance out that learning, not denying it, but sort of balance out the facts and educate people in a way which doesn't sort of like stunt or retard their character development, we could say. And to give you another example, and this isn't even a very moralistic example. This is actually because it like the problem here is not always moralistic. I mean, the examples with colonialization and slavery and all that, yeah, they are very moralistic, and we've been through a crisis of we're still going through a crisis of how do countries educate people around these issues. In Germany, for example, this is a big issue today. I mean, how do I spent a few months in Germany last year, and I was sort of thinking to myself, if I lived here and I had a kid, and they were in school, could I go in and say to the teacher, can they not do the whole, guilty historical lessons about the Holocaust thing? Because I'm not saying it didn't happen, but he's Irish, like, is it really involved in that? Can I skip that? I would kind of wonder what the principal, what the school would say if that would be an acceptable excuse, And I kind of wonder if all these Turkish people, for example, that are now in Germany, think the same thing. Do they sort of get their kid and go, do they have to do this? Like it's almost like I remember in school when I was doing the communion and the confirmation, because I went to a Catholic school, there was one or two people that were like, just their family just didn't want their kid to be involved in religion, or they were Protestant instead of Catholic, or they were atheist or something, right? They sat out of the religious ceremonies and the religious classes. They just sat in the lunchroom or something and did their homework or something like this. So I kind of you kind of wonder, like, could you, because historical education can be very religious in its tone, and the kind of reverence people use when they talk about historical issues is really more reverence than anything religious today. I mean, actual religion doesn't enjoy anywhere near the reverence that historical education actually enjoys. But anyway, putting the kind of hyper moralistic stuff aside, because that's more of a particular symptom of our time than it is Nietzsche's time. Putting that aside, to give an anecdotal example of this issue, where I think my Irish unhistoricized brain finds this really confusing and funny. Um, uh, I was in the DDR Museum in Berlin. A DDR Museum in Berlin, people don't know, is basically like um, it's just like this the East German Soviet Union stuff. It's just like a little kind of weird museum. It's very small and it's not very interesting or good. I didn't enjoy it at all. And it's just like this weird small museum. It's overpriced. It's like 15 quid to get in, and everyone says, it's a big tourist attraction there. Uh, it's just stuff from the 80s. It's just stuff from the fucking 80s. That's all it is. It's the most uninteresting place museum I've ever been to in my life. It's just stuff from the 80s. Literally. Like I went in there and I just felt like I was in my grandparents' house, or like I were like back in the day, like for the furniture just looked like my grandparents' furniture. Like the TV looked like it was from the 80s. There was nothing interesting about it. It was, and then I left a comment on a kind of review just as a joke. I think I had a few beers afterwards, and I was just like, I'm just going to play a joke, and I went on the website and left a Google review, because you know the way Google sometimes sends you these notifications like you were at the DDR museum, give it a review. It just kind of gave me the options. Like okay, and I just said it was a bunch of stuff from the 80s, and I got this response from the staff there saying, well, thank you for your comment, Owen, but the DDR museum is more than just stuff from the 80s. It's a reminder of the Soviet Union and the split divide between Germany and Berlin and blah 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 blah. And I was like, no, it wasn't. It was just a bunch of stuff from the 80s. Like you're giving this too much. You're giving this far too much meaning, because I literally went in there and I just felt like you put my grandparents' house in a bloody museum, and then there's a little bit of interesting things about like there was some stuff to do with like security patrols on the wall. If you went through the wall, if you were trying to jump over the wall, for example, to get from east to west, um this is some of the things you might encounter and blah 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 blah. I mean, okay, fair enough, but it literally was just a bunch of furniture from the 80s. So I'm starting to see this. I was starting to see, once I read this essay, these distinctions in character between people that are, you might call over historicized, people that are less historicized. Um, and again, Ireland, I don't know if it's because we were colonized for so long and our actual republic is so recent that we've just sort of tried to block out all the history. but we're like, there's not like, the only museums here, generally speaking, really are like like museums about Vikings and Normans and things. Like it's really old. Most of the modern and early modern period is just blocked out. We just don't talk. We don't historicize it at all. Um, Maybe that's a bad thing. Maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. But it's just interesting to see, the distinction if I'm in a country like Germany or England, or America, where the memory of slavery and so forth is such a big thing. These these historicized countries, um, who historicize their modern and early modern periods, really seem sort of crazy to me sometimes. And the most shocking thing about the DDR museum was like, it was literally just like it was so recently. I mean, the Berlin Wall fell in like what, 89 or something. So it's like, you know, or 91, whatever the fucking date was. You know, so recently things get so immediately historicized. Things which to me seem sort of present, you know, just furniture that looks like it was from a few decades ago is immediately sort of museumified and historicized. I could imagine soon there'll be like museums for like phones, like button phones. You've got smartphones, screen phones taking over everything like 10 years ago. I'm pretty sure soon there's going to be like museums for phones and buttons, and I'm going to be like, well, hey, I use these phones and buttons like like 15 years ago. Like this is not that. This is not very far away. You know? Like um, there's a kind of distancing that's going on. I think with this over historicization as well. There's a kind of um, pushing something which is actually quite immediate further and further and further back, further away. Get rid of it. Get rid of it. Get rid of it. And just thinking off the top of my head now, why the DDR museum basically just puts things from a bunch of furniture from the 80s in a room and says it's a museum. It's not like it's so ridiculous. It's probably because they kind of don't know how to handle. No, it's probably because there's actually a kind of divide in Germany to this day between East and West. And there is. Like, you see that in the way people vote, for example. Um, there's a divide between the wealthier, basically West Germans and people that were still, because you see, there's lots of people in East Germany, for example, that were living in the Soviet Union. I mean, there's lots of them. I mean, it wasn't that long ago. You know, if you were born before 89 or wherever the kind of the unification happened, um, which was like a lot of people, you were living through the Soviet Union. So it's almost like they're trying to kind of like distance those people, you know, make a museum out of their sort of Soviet world. But the funny thing was, it looked so similar to our world. Like it's not that different, you know. Like almost anything that I saw in that museum about people there just seemed like anyone from the 80s. It was a little bit different in some ways, like aesthetically. You know, there's more brutalist architecture, for example. The furniture looked a bit drabbier and a bit older than. But I swear to God, like go to my grandparents' house in the south of England, in the 80s, and it looked exactly like the furniture in that museum. You know, so like I feel like they're trying to use historical frame in order to like push, kind of like, I don't know, like distance themselves from people almost that are like literally living there and like literally are like breathing, living now. It's very strange. Okay, but enough about the speculations on the kind of more sort of ideological side to over historicization. But so basically, Nietzsche continues in his essay to discuss history as three modes. And this is what I quite like about his essay, that he does get a little bit more structural, and that is helpful. There's three modes. One is called monumental history, one is critical history, and one is antiquarian history. Okay, so these are actually really helpful categories. I think this is. I wish Nietzsche would, just as a side note on Nietzsche's style, I wish he would sometimes be a bit more structural. You know, if you read like The Gay Science or something, or Human All to Human. Actually, Genealogy of Morals is structural enough for me to be to not have this complaint. But some of his works are so kind of so many aphorisms, and so I actually quite like the structuralism, because I think that it can be helpful. It can be helpful. Anyway, you got these three modes of history. So basically, monumental history in very simple terms. I'm going to read some passages to describe each of them, so you can see in Nietzsche's own words. But monumental history is basically kind of history that inspires greatness. You know, it's the way people talk about Caesar today, or we watch a film about Alexander the Great or Napoleon. It's kind of, I would say, it's very thematically charged history. It gives you an energy, it gives you an inspiration. It performs it gives a kind of identification for great people. Inspires action, future achievements. I think there's a kind of invigoration and a kind of will to the future. So basically, okay. So what maybe I'll just, then critical history is more criticizing the past. I think you get this in like critical theory and viewing the past from a more critical lens. It doesn't necessarily at this point have to be even progressive. You can do that from a conservative perspective too. You could critically analyze the '60s and the effect the '60s and counterculture had on Western society, for example. You could criticize the Industrial Revolution from a traditionalist perspective. But it's basically a critical view of history. You're looking at history through primarily a critical lens, and you're kind of saying this was bad in some sense, and you have to learn from that. And then there's antiquarian history. Antiquarian history is very English. I have to say this. It's very, very, very English. I've had the privilege of being able to live in a few different European countries for some period of time, so I can make these comparisons. And yeah, it's very, very English. The antiquarian history is kind of cozy, I would say. It's cozy. It's it sets up a historical not knowledge, of course, but it has a kind of very much an aesthetic and a sort of sense of belonging in it, right? People want to feel like they belong. They want to feel like they're part of a greater history, a greater lineage. That they have roots, and I would say they sort of immerse themselves. History is therefore, with antiquarian history, somewhat of an immersion project. Actually, it's all an immersion project to some extent, but it doesn't immerse you in the monumental sense, which is very kind of bombastic and maybe more conflict prone and kind of audacious and so forth. It's kind of immersing you in something that makes you feel cozy and at home, I would say. And I would say that seems, I think the English fit that bill more than anyone, it seems to me. But anyway, I'm going to read some passages to describe each of these in Nietzsche's own words. Okay, so all right. First, I'm going to read out something about which Nietzsche wrote about monumental history. So, monumental history says, "Quote: As long as the soul of historical writing lies in the great driving impulses which a powerful man derives from it, as long as the past must be written about as worthy of imitation, is capable of being imitated with the possibility of a second occurrence, history is definitely in danger of becoming something altered, reinterpreted into something more beautiful, and thus coming close to free poeticizing. Indeed, there are times which one cannot distinguish at all between a monumental history and a mythic fiction, because from a single from a single world, one of these impulses can be derived as easily as the other." As stop for a second there. You think of Alexander, right? So Caesar wanted to be like Alexander. Napoleon wanted to be like Caesar and Alexander, right? But then, who did Alexander want to be like? You know, Heracles, Achilles, right? So if you go far enough back, you start to just lose a concrete historical reference point, and you sort of go into myth. And I suppose if you're looking at the history of men who were inspired in this sense, you are looking at something which sort of delved into myth in its existence itself. Like it was inspired by myth and it sort of imitated myth. So there is a blurry line, particularly within monumental history, between myth and historical reality. We could probably assume then the monumental historian is not so concerned with like the nitty gritty facts, names and dates, the nitty gritty facts. He's more concerned with the energetics, and the identification and the sort of potentiality and possibility which great achievement in the past offers him. Monumental history deceives through its analogies. It attracts the spirited man to daring acts with its seductive similarities, and the enthusiastic man to fanaticism. If we imagine this history really in the hands and heads of the talented egoists and the wild crowds of evil rascals, then empires are destroyed, leaders assassinated, wars and revolutions instigated, and the number of the historical effects in themselves, that is, effects without adequate causes, increased once more. No matter how much monumental history can serve to remind us of the injuries among great people and active people, whether for better or for worse, that is what it first brings about when the impotent and inactive empower themselves with it and serve it. Let us take the simplest and most frequent example. If we imagine to ourselves uncultured and weakly cultured natures energized and armed by a monumental culture, against whom will they now direct their weapons? Against their hereditary enemies, the strong cultural spirits, and also against the only ones who are able to learn truly from that history, that is, for life, and to convert what they have learned into a noble practice. For them, scroll down. For them, the path will be blocked and the air darkened. If we dance around a half understood monument of some great past or other, like a truly zealous idolaters, as if we wanted to state, see that is the true and real culture, so forth. Okay. Monumental history has, I suppose, two sides to it. It's obviously very, energizing, and it inspires greatness. But at the same time, I suppose what Nietzsche is saying, that if it's taken up by people who are, let's say, a kind of a bit less cultured, or by people maybe who are kind of acting out a kind of position of ressentiment, it can be quite dangerous. It could be quite deceptive. It could be, I suppose, it can be useful for crowds, right? For a kind of crowd mob mentality. And we see this with Caesar even. So it's not exactly like this is particularly even exclusively a modern problem, but this, I suppose, you can draw on the energies of people for a goal, but those people maybe their over-involvement might, to some extent, if you wanted to be kind of elitist about it, deprive or distort that relation to history itself. It may be used for lower, more vulgar ends. I was thinking a little bit here about like the Soviet Union and how, like, Lenin, for example, that Lenin was definitely a monumental historian. He definitely was someone deeply inspired by the past, the French revolutionaries. Even Trotsky wrote often quite affectionately about Cromwell. So you have this, what Fukuyama would call megalothymia, a kind of megalothymotic impulse, often, which bursts out and can create a kind of new potentiality, a new future. But I suppose, I guess Nietzsche's just a bit of an elitist, and I mean, for good reason. I mean, we've kind of been through the Soviet Union, so things can start to decay, and then that, those monuments, I suppose, can kind of become like merely propagandistic or something. I mean, if you think about the monuments of Lenin that are all over what was the Soviet Union, that this is a good sort of example of this problem, where you have a society which was sort of built by these founders, and the society is sort of going into decline. Yet the sort of monument, the kind of identification with these monumental figures, sort of remains nonetheless. It's interesting. It's not even entirely a bad thing. It is potentially deceptive, I suppose you could say, that it can sort of drag you out of the reality of the society you're in at the time you're in, into a kind of cope, I suppose. The United States is actually somewhat similar to this too. It's its founding fathers, who were carved into a big rock somewhere in the country. I don't know where exactly that is, but obviously it's a thing, and you do get people that kind of relate to the founding fathers in America on a kind of quasi mythological basis, and that relation can be used to distort the fact that to distort the actual condition that the society is in and the people are in the society, more or less. So yeah, monumental history, good for ambition, good for the megalothymodic identifications, good for action, good for inspiration, but potentially deceptive in a certain way, especially when you could say a kind of crowd mentality or a kind of uncultured people are over involved in that process. And the same thing can be said for nationalism, I think. There's something also theatrical, just to finish up on this point about monumental history. There's something theatrical about it. This is a good, potentially theatrical about it. This is a good point which is made here. Monumental history is the theatrical costume in which they pretend that their hate for the powerful and the great of their time is a fulfilling admiration for the strong and the great of the past times. Okay, so you can use this. You can conceal your resentment for the great and the powerful of your own time by kind of pretending that you're actually just invoking the great and the powerful of past times. So there's a concealment of resentment. I was thinking here again of people. I was thinking here of something like Che Guevara and the left. I remember it used to. I don't know if it is anymore, but it used to be very common. You'd see Che Guevara flags. I remember I was at a protest many years ago because there was austerity movements in Ireland. They were trying to privatize the water supply, IMF after the big crash, all that. So there's a lot of political kind of anti-austerity stuff, which I got involved with to some degree. And I remember I was at a protest, and this guy was dressed like Che Guevara, he was literally dressed exactly like this Irish guy was dressed exactly like Che Guevara, like he was wearing a Halloween costume. The hat, the symbol on the hat, the star on the hat, the kind of military outfit, the beard. He may have even taken out a cigar at one point. You get this mainly on the left, because if you do anything like that on the right today, you'll be fucking arrested. But on the left, you do get a certain allowance for it, because it's so fake, I suppose. The authorities just don't care. It's a LARP, So here within monumental history, you have the potential for LARPing, basically. You see this online now. Loads of people's anonymous accounts are named after someone it could be Napoleon, or it could be Caesar, or it could be a fictional character for fucking Lord of the Rings or something. You know what I mean? You've got all this sort of a kind of bombastic kind of posturing of greatness. Something mythological and something historical could be invoked. And I'm not against it. It's fun. I think there's psychologically, why not invoke something from the past and identify with it and sort of use that energy. But I suppose often that energy doesn't really go anywhere, and it's just a kind of coping mechanism. It's just a LARP. It's just there to sort of make people feel better about the shitty kind of inactivity of their life. They're basically their existence as last men. Could be sort of the sting of that can be taken off if they sort of LARP like a great historical person or something like this, right? So the risk here is basically self-deception. That there's a high risk of self-deception involved in monumental history. Okay, let's read let's read a description of the antiquarian. This time we're going to look at the antiquarian historian. The small, limited. Oh, sorry. That's not where I was supposed to read from. Okay. History belongs, secondly, to the man who preserves and honors, to the person who, with faith and love, looks back in the direction from which he has come. Through this reverence, he, as it were, gives thanks for his existence, while he nurtures with a gentle hand what has stood from time immemorial. He wants to preserve the conditions under which he came into existence for those who are to come after him. So he wants to preserve. He wants to preserve the conditions which he came for people who come after him, basically. So he's got a strong sense of lineage and historical continuity, and so he serves life. His possession of his ancestors' goods changes the ideas in such a soul, for those goods are far from likely to take possession of his soul. The small, limited, crumbling, and archaic keep their own worth and integrity, because the conserving and honoring soul of the antiquarian man settles on these things and there prepares for itself a secret nest. The history of his city becomes for him the history of his own self. He understands the walls, the turreted gate, the dictate of the city council, and the folk festival like an illustrated diary of his youth, and he rediscovers for him in all his force, his purpose, his passion, his opinion, his foolishness, his bad habits. He says to himself, here one could live, for here one may live, and here one can go on living, because we endure and do not collapse overnight. Thus, with the we, he looks back over the past amazing lives of individuals and feels himself like the spirit of the house, the generation, and the city. Okay, so he's I like this analogy of a nest. He builds himself a nest, builds himself a little secret nest in his history. And again, this is I just think this is somewhat of an English thing to do. I don't know if it's because they preserved their monarchy and they sort of have a kind of unthreatening monarchy where they don't really have much power, but they sort of create a sort of historical sense of identification with the past. England's obviously a very old country, and it's a country that's largely avoided a lot of the modern catastrophes, like the way Germany, for example, or Russia went through in the 20th century, kind of devastating wars in which a lot of their cities were destroyed. Like look at like Dresden, although they've built up Dresden to make it look like it used to be and so on. But if you go to some cities in Germany, you will see like it looks like, for example, the architecture looks like, really modern stuff is built in between really old stuff. There's this sort of almost kind of a battle for the old, but actually that's also the case in big cities in England, for example. You have these almost like Manhattan knockoff skyscrapers in London, and then you have these like 800-year-old pubs, scattered throughout that skyscraper landscape. So yeah. I mean, it's not exactly exclusively an issue for somewhere like Russia or Germany, but nonetheless, England did avoid these revolutionary or World War like kind of crisis and catastrophes at least within their own country, and I do think that's allowed them to sort of feel a more of a sort of antiquarian sense of lineage. Also, probably the people who take this antiquarian position to the most extreme would be like the Amish. The Amish are kind of antiquarian cultures. Like, now they do this with technology. I think more than anything, they sort of reject the use of technology so that they can create a community which is, I said, more cozy, more snuggled into a sense of historical depth an historical past. Um, so yeah, so there's a immersion, I would say, while the monumental historian is immersed in the greatness of the past in a very sort of bombastic sense, and it's very risky, megalothymatic sense. The antiquarian is more he's less conflict prone. He's less bombastic, um, and he sort of nestles into a I think largely aesthetic as well, an aesthetic immersion with his own history, and he strongly identifies. See, I think the monumental historian identifies more particularly with certain times and certain people and certain events. You know, like if you've ever seen the film Alexander 2004, Oliver Stone's Alexander, um, Poltemi, who's played by that old Welsh actor, what's his name, Anthony Hopkins. Um, at the end, he's like reciting um, uh, the story of Alexander in the army, because he was in the army, of course, and he's old and he's dying, and he's reciting what happened. He's remembering what happened, and he was like saying, "Oh, I have sons and grandsons, and they're very nice and they're very good and they're very smart, but they'll never know what it was like to be at the Battle of Gaugamela. They'll never know what it was like to see Alexander dressed up in armor, making us feel like we could do anything." So like the monumental historian is kind of particular, and he's more elitist, I would say too. Um, he identifies with champions and great leaders and great moments of great struggle and great triumph, whereas I feel like the antiquarian historian identifies more civically, you could say. Well, that's not necessarily. It's not, maybe civically isn't the right word. More communitarianly, more generally, he identifies with, the old gate. He's like the old guy in a city or a town who could tell you all the little ins and outs of the history of that place. Like, this is when this law changed. This was when they built that. This is actually quite Irish too. Irish people could be a little bit antiquarian. It's not just English, now that I think about it. Irish people too. Like, you'll get someone who'll tell you, oh, like an old person in Ireland who will tell you when a bridge was built, 50 years ago, and who built it and why and when. I'll give you all these little details. Um, you get Americans who come over to Ireland, and I have a friend actually who lives kind of in the countryside, and there's a tiny graveyard down the road from where he lives, and he lives in the countryside, like he lives like next to farms and stuff. So he lives like absolutely. This is not even like a small housing estate or something, or even a small town. This is like the countryside in between towns, with a few houses on a big road, and there's a tiny graveyard. It's mainly an old farming community kind of place, and there's a tiny graveyard for those people. And he's said that more than once he's been walking past that graveyard and he's heard American accents in the graveyard, because they've located their ancestors, and they've gone back, they've gone all the way back, and they've paid their dues to their great great grandfather or something, who was probably just some farmer who lived in the area, and this sort of reverence and enthusiasm for all the little details, and everyone is it's more kind of, you could say, not democratic necessarily. It's more egalitarian, and it's more provincial. It's more egalitarian. Immersion in the past and all the little details, and all the turret gate, and the person who built the bridge, and the person who opened up the pub, and so on and so forth. So it's sort of the peasantry. It's the peasant history. It's not the great, the warrior history. It's the peasant history, we could say. So he'll say that the problem with the antiquarian is that well, there's a few issues here. Um, One is that he becomes quite provincial. He becomes very kind of satisfied. I suppose he's so good at like immersing himself and nesting himself into a small local place because everything is invoked with so much meaning. Who built the bridge when the gate was changed? Who built the pub? Everything has so much sort of like purpose, and he's so immersed in this little kind of provincial. Um, uh, it doesn't always have to be provincial. I mean, like one could live in a big city, for example, and develop an antiquarian like of like foreign exotic like Egyptian, for example, people who collect like Egyptian, I don't know, like historical pieces, museum pieces, people who collect museum pieces, kind of even kind of adventurous archaeologists are a little bit antiquarian, Indiana Jones, because they project a lot of meaning into these small things, like it's never like the big war or the big event or the big revolution or the great man. It's always something like the gate or the pottery or the it's always something small and kind of almost trivial that it's invoked with a lot of meaning. So some of the side effects of this could be, I suppose, a lack of ambition, that people become too easily satisfied within a small kind of provincial setting. Um, you can think of someone who's lived in like one small town their whole lives or something, and they've never really gone outside of that. I mean, and they really really strongly identify with that town and the history of that town and everything, even when it's very trivial. Yeah, of course, there's nothing wrong with this. There's nothing bad about it in and of itself, but it can come, I suppose, with a lack of ambition or a lack of a lack of ambition, a lack of desire to experience things themselves. There's a kind of flattening out of their value system. Things that are very small can become excessively valuable to them. Maybe they become petty because of that. Who knows? There's a lot of different side effects it could have. One thing Nietzsche will point out is a narrow vision. He says the antiquarian sense of a person, a civic community, an entire people always has a very highly restricted field of vision. It does not perceive most things at all, and the few things which it does perceive, it looks so far too closely and in isolation. It cannot measure it, and therefore takes everything as equally important. Thus, for the antiquarian sense, each single thing is too important, for it assigns to the things of the past no difference in value. It's kind of what I was saying. Yeah, like it assigns no difference in value. Everything becomes equally as important, right? And there's a museumification problem here too. Like everything old gets put in a museum. Like you'll have like, oh, this was a piece of pottery from whatever. Oh, this was a piece of a railroad from whatever. It's like, well, what is this stuff? If anything like this was come across and it was made within the past 20 years, we just throw it in the bin. But just because it's old, it suddenly has this great value to it, and that value really is. I mean, like maybe understanding, for example, things like pottery, or take for example pottery. Like it can help you understand the sort of anthropology of the past. Like if you were looking at the pottery of, like, I don't know, ancient Sumerian communities or something, it can have a big effect, because we can say these people had writing or didn't have writing. They had this kind of technology or that technology. They used these sorts of weapons or these tools. I mean, it can be big. Like these small things can be consequential in a kind of scientific anthropological investigation of communities, that historical people that we don't know anything about. But there's also just literally people just like this stuff for the sake of it being old. They just sort of project some sort of value into it because it's old. It's as simple as that, And there's nothing wrong with that, but it does make everything of equal value, which is, I suppose, not really good in some ways. The main critique we could say with antiquarian, um, the antiquarian historian is that he knows how to preserve things. This is what Nietzsche says. Antiquarian history knows only how to preserve life and not how to generate it. It doesn't know how to generate it. So it's good at preserving things of value, although it can overvalue things too and lose a kind of hierarchy of values. But it's you know it sort of looks back at um, what were the conditions which made life possible and made striving possible and flourishing possible, and that is a very good instinct. That's very correct. But it doesn't know how to sort of radically alter that. It doesn't know how to sort of generate that from a new genesis, from a new origin. It's it's only a preserver. I actually do think there's one very good literary analogy of the antiquarian historian, and that is actually in Lord of the Rings is the hobbits, right? Um, the hobbits, the Shire, for example, is described as kind of a very antiquarian place. People have a deep respect for the little things. They sort of very strongly identify with their community. They probably have a good awareness of the history of it and the particularities. But they're sort of small-minded and stuck in a very small enclosed place. Um, and you see this actually in Lord of the Rings when, after the big adventure, after the three films happens, and Sam and Frodo and Merry and Pippin go back to the Shire, and they've been through this big adventure, and they've seen the whole Middle Earth, and they've been through all these wars. They've been through a kind of monumental history, like these hobbits who are antiquarian historian types go and they involve themselves with these wizards and kings, and they involve themselves in this great monumental historical process, which was the battle for Middle Earth, right? And once that's all said and done, they go back to the Shire, and then they sit there in the pub, and they get a few pints, and it's actually really sad. Like they sit there and they're kind of like looking at each other like God, like everything here is so small and meaningless now. Like now that we've seen everything, we've involved ourselves with monumental history. We've come back to this place full this antiquarian place, and it just seems so trivial. Like it's sort of its immersive power is lost. You know, it's its meaning is lost. Like who cares who built the fucking gate? Who cares whose great great grandfather built the pub? You know what I mean? Like it's sort of its meaning is gone. It's like an old lover. The spark is gone. It's very sad. And then obviously Frodo then goes off to the with the elves to the bloody whatever it's called, the forever place, immanentized elf heaven or whatever the hell. I don't like that part about Lord of the Rings. I don't like that they give the elves like an island in the west, which is sort of heaven. It's like I don't understand it. This is the part of Lord of the Rings I don't like, but the part of Lord of the Rings which is very good, actually, is because it centers around the hobbits. Actually, who are the kind of, in some sense, they're not really the main characters. I always think like Aragorn is the main character, but like they're sort of the original character which we view the story from. Like we originally start with the Shire and the hobbits and Frodo and Sam, and then we go into all the elves and all the kings and all the warriors and the wizards and so. And but you do within. I think the interesting thing about this story from Tolkien, which is never discussed, is that it does basically show a kind of a distinction between antiquarian history and monumental history. That the antiquarian hobbits go and have an adventure with the monumental with the monumental historical actors of these great kings and wizards, um, and then they go back and they're like, shit, what do we do now? You know, they should make a fourth Lord of the Rings. This is like similar to how Zizek says, I want a V for Vendetta Part Two. Like, what happens after they've defeated the authoritarian government? What happens then? Like, I want the same thing for Lord of the Rings. Like, what happens once, like, the big monumental history has been played out, and the hobbits are back in the Shire and they're just miserable? Like, you know, what do they do? Like, what do they do with themselves? Did they go back to Gondor? Did they stay there? Did they set up a small business selling garden furniture? Like, what did they do? You know? Okay, the last but not least historical category we're going to cover in this section is critical history, the critical historian. Okay, so reading from Nietzsche once again. This is in the service of the living. So in some sense, Nietzsche's saying all of these are in the service of the living. These are not modes of history which are not, in some sense, in the service of the living. They all have some service. Okay. Once again, this is the service of the living. A person must have the power, and from time to time use it to break a past and to dissolve it, in order to be able to live. He manages to do this by dragging the past before the court of justice, investigating it meticulously, and finally condemning it. That past is worthy of condemnation, for that is how it stands with human things. In them, human force and weakness have always been strong. Here it is not righteousness which sits in the judgment of seat, or even less mercy which announces judgment, but life alone, the dark, driving, insatiable, self-desiring force. Its judgment is always unmerciful, always unjust, because it never emerges from a pure spring of knowledge, but in most cases the judgment would be like that anyway, even if the righteousness itself were to utter, for everything that arises is worth destroying. Therefore, it would be better that nothing arose. Okay, I'll end it there. So the critical historian obviously is striving towards something new, a kind of break, a kind of cut from the past, maybe like a kind of year zero, we could even say. And he's doing this for life. Like, he's doing this to flourish, to will a future. Again here, obviously very typical associations we can make with the critical historian is revolutions, revolutionaries, kind of any revolution really, the American Revolution, which created a kind of radical cut from England, Irish Revolution, Russian Revolution, the French, particularly the French Revolution, because it didn't just create a sort of break in authority between one country and another, but between one political system and another. The Protestant Reformation as well would be in this spirit. So there's obviously an attempt here to break with a radical break with the past. Perhaps you could also bring into this these kind of categories of critical history, something like the countercultures in the post-war period, 68 and so forth. So there's a split, a schism, an attempt to create something new, quite radically, by creating a sort of negative and critical relationship to the past. So I'll read a bit more. Let's read it. Nietzsche complicates it though. He says, "For when its past is analyzed critically, then we grasp with a knife at its roots and go cruelly beyond all reverence. It is always a dangerous process, that is, a dangerous process for life itself, and people or ages serving life in this way, by judging and destroying a past, are always dangerous and in danger. For since We are now the products of earlier generations. We are also the products of their aberrations, passions, mistakes, and even crimes. It is impossible to loose oneself from this chain entirely. When we condemn that confusion and consider ourselves released from it, then we have not overcome the fact that we are derived from it. Okay, I'll stop there for a second. That's a really, really good, kind of sober. It's weird to see Nietzsche being the kind of sober voice of reason. But in this case, he really is. Like, the critical historians sort of they lose track of the fact that I suppose they sort of consider themselves like pure agents in some way, don't they? They think that they have a kind of pure capacity to sort of abstract themselves from the effects of history and of generational conditioning and of societal conditioning, and they can sort of abstract, often morally, and kind of relinquish any connection to the past that they're criticizing, to sort of cut it, and there's a deception in that, because they don't appreciate the fact that they are the result to some extent, not that we're all totally predetermined or conditioned, but they are to some extent the products of their own of the earlier generations' mistakes and aberrations and crimes. And I really, really think the boomers are like this, because if you think about what the boomers have done, the boomers have set themselves up in opposition to the previous generations that conducted the first two world wars, and there was a lot of passions and crimes going on then, and they've really set themselves up in opposition to that, and they've really sort of created this kind of post-war structure of how do you say, like, relinquishing themselves, cutting the roots, relinquishing themselves from the past earlier than 1946, basically, or 1968 maybe, or something like this, right? They've really radically cut those roots, and I think a lot of young people today feel somewhat more in they kind of feel more harmony with either the antiquarian or with the monumental, because that sort of that restores those cut roots. The boomers, maybe Gen X to a certain extent as well. Basically, the first post-war generations really cut ourselves off from those historical roots in a very critical method, kind of critical theory, critical method. And that was probably a mistake because it's not just, and here's the interesting thing Nietzsche is saying, it's not just a mistake for our identity or because history happened and it's important in a kind of factual, historical way, scientific way. It's important for life. Like, there was something about the knowledge of the world before that which was important for life. Yes, there was a lot of catastrophes in the early 20th century, but once you cut that off, you don't just deprive us of knowledge or identification, you deprive us of life, actually. And that's actually really what people are seeing today. They feel lost and without kind of reference points, historical reference points, I don't like the word identity. I think this is a bit of a red herring, but I know what you mean. A kind of a sort of a feeling as if they're part of a longer lineage. They don't feel they're so easily inspired by historical figures of the past, or that they're sort of immersed in a sort of more provincial community of historical identification as the antiquarian historian is. So it's kind of like the critical historian. It's quite good at creating something new. It is actually quite good at creating something new, but it sort of severs us from the past so much that it sort of, I would say, it kind of traps us in a kind of endless, kind of lost, confused state where that newness quickly becomes a kind of like that novelty doesn't necessarily lead to more life. It can lead to the opposite, actually. And failing to see how, for example, like take the boomers, failing to see how they were conditioned by previous histories is really, so for example, if you say to, like, most boomers, it's like, okay, you think in this way so radically because you're reacting to what happened in the early 20th century. So you're kind of overcompensating here, right? If you They won't accept that. They won't accept that they're sort of determined to some extent by a historical lineage. Like, there's a kind of swings and roundabouts. There's this kind of dialectic, or there's cyclical cycles which involve in them their own sort of dialectics and tensions and compensations and movements. They won't accept that. Like, the boomers will just say, no, 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 no. What we created was new, but it was a universal truth. It was an indefinite universal truth. Everyone was wrong until us, and we made it, and we made the correct judgment of how we should live and what we should do, and then it's universalized, and then it's globalized. You then push this on everyone in the world, in the Middle East, Africa, wherever, and you get this kind of liberal hegemonic, at least in our century, in our time. This is how the critical history has played out. You get this liberal hegemonic kind of global system, and they don't take into account that the way they think may be sort of influenced by a sort of reaction or a trauma or a compensation for what happened in the first half of the 20th century. They just consider themselves to be correct. They're undetermined. 2 plus 2 is 4. Okay, 2 plus 2 is 4. You can't say, oh yeah, look, it was 5 last century, and that was a bit much, so now we're going to bring it down a bit. Now it's 4, and maybe next century it'll be 3, so we got to bring it up again. And it's they treat, like, their historical character like math. They don't accept that there's sort of there's a sort of parameter of space in which is undetermined. Sorry, not undetermined, which is conditioned in reaction to previous mistakes and failures and passions and so forth. It's just math to them. And then Nietzsche will also say about the critical historian that they try to create a new nature. This is what the critical historian does. That they try to cut themselves off from an old nature and create a new nature. But he says that what they fail to realize is that whenever this happens, one is always still, even if they introduce a new nature, okay, they're still heavily, if not in a kind of majority sense or a kind of primary sense, influenced by the old nature. That one never just jumps from an old nature to a new nature. There's always a contest. If you make a jump, there's always a kind of contest between the new nature and the old nature, and that contest will be the old nature will be present in them, and it will actually potentially be kind of primarily present in them. And I think, again, if you look at the boomers, I think that's really a good identification for this problem, because if you think about the boomers, they all became hippies, and they were like all like, anti kind of bourgeois kind of liberal consumers. But then in their kind of second half of their life, they all became like an exaggerated version of that. They really rebelled against this sort of idea that they're just these sort of boring, one-dimensional, superficial, kind of Western consumers, who they obviously identified their parents to be. But then they sort of rebelled against that in their youth. But in the second half of their life, they not only became that, they became an exaggerated version of that, and they created a world which was an exaggerated world of that. Right? Like, they didn't see their own nature. They sort of they assumed that they'd made this big jump, and then that was it. It was over. They didn't see the internal struggle that was still going on within themselves. Again, it's a kind of problem of self-deception which is going on here.